The sound cracked through first class like a rifle shot at close range. Crystal trembled on every tray table. A man in seat 2C stopped mid-sip, his wine tipping dangerously toward the rim of the glass, and for one frozen second, the entire cabin seemed to hang suspended in the thin air 7 miles above Kansas. Elias Monroe did not move. A red handprint bloomed slowly across his left cheek, stark against his skin under the soft amber cabin lights. He did not touch his face. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there in the narrow aisle of Sterling Horizon Flight 2T140, his backpack still half-tucked into the overhead bin above Seat 1A, and let the silence do what silence always does in rooms full of people who would rather not get involved. Brenda Colt's hand hung in the air a beat too long before she pulled it back to her side. For half a second, something raw and uncertain flickered across her face, and then it was gone, folded back beneath 19 years of practiced composure. "Sit down, sir," she said, her voice low and level, the voice of a woman who had never once been told no, and meant to keep it that way. "This behavior is unacceptable." The word hung there, unacceptable. Nobody in the cabin challenged it. Elias turned his head slowly, and when his eyes met hers, there was nothing in them that matched what had just happened to his face. It was not the calm of a man who didn't understand. It was the calm of a man who understood completely. "I stood up to speak with the captain," he said. "Quiet. Even. That's all I did." Something tightened in Brenda's jaw. For a moment, irritation flashed behind her eyes. Or maybe something sharper than irritation. But she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin the way she had 1,000 times before with 1,000 other passengers who had never once pushed back. "You were told to remain seated. You refused. That makes you a disruption." Across the aisle in seat 1B, a man in a $5,000 suit let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Preston Wade said nothing. He didn't need to. The small curl at the corner of his mouth said enough for both of them. Nobody stood. Nobody asked a question. A woman, 2 rows back in a cream-colored coat, lifted her eyes just long enough to register what she'd seen, then lowered them again, as if she had decided in that instant it wasn't her business. It wasn't the absence of sound that filled the cabin then. It was something heavier. The particular silence of people who know exactly what they just watched and have already decided, almost without thinking about it, that saying so out loud would cost them more than staying quiet. Elias let that silence sit for a moment. Then, without another word, he lowered himself back into seat 1A. The motion was slow and deliberate. He reached for the buckle and clicked his seatbelt shut, and somehow that small metallic click sounded louder than it had any right to. On the edge of his tray table, something thin and metallic caught the cabin light. A card, no bigger than a credit card, brushed steel with a faint engraving that nobody in that cabin recognized yet. Not yet. Because in less than 4 minutes, that silence was going to break wide open, and the people who had looked away were going to spend a very long time wishing they hadn't. Near the galley, a 24-year-old flight attendant named Maya Sinclair stood frozen with a folded linen napkin crushed in her fist, watching Brenda's shoulders reset themselves into something that looked, from a distance, almost like victory. Maya had seen everything. She just hadn't found the courage yet to say so. 9 hours earlier, before the engines had ever spun up and the ground had dropped away beneath them, Elias Monroe stood in the fluorescent glow of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, rain streaking the tall windows into ribbons of red and white light. It was 6:52 on a Friday morning in March, and the terminal moved with that particular hum of people trying not to be late, rolling suitcases, clipped phone calls, gate announcements dissolving into the polished floor. He didn't rush. He stood near the edge of the priority lane, with one hand resting on the strap of a backpack that had clearly outlived several other bags around it. Canvas gone soft and gray at the corners, a frayed loop where a keychain used to hang. His jacket was denim, faded at the elbows. His sneakers were clean, but old enough that the tread had gone smooth in the middle. Nothing about him asked for attention, which was exactly why he got it. The gate agent, a woman with a laminated name tag that read Denies, glanced up as the next boarding group was called. Her eyes moved down the line. A man in a tailored overcoat, a couple dragging matching Rimowa luggage, a woman checking her Cartier watch against the departure board, and then landed on Elias. They paused there a beat longer than they had on anyone else. "Sir," she said, not quite meeting his eyes, her tone sliding from warm to neutral in the space of one syllable. "Boarding for economy hasn't started. You'll want to wait behind the line." "My pass says Group 1, Elias said. She looked at him again, the jacket, the backpack, the sneakers, as if the information in front of her didn't match the picture she'd already drawn. "May I see it?" He handed it over. Her fingers held the paper a fraction too tightly while she checked it twice. The scanner beeped a clean, confirming green. Group 1, Seat 1A. For half a second, something like embarrassment moved across her face. Then it disappeared behind a fast, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're all set," she said. No apology, just a small step aside, as if clearing a path she hadn't meant to block in the first place. "Thank you," Elias said, and walked on. Behind him, a man in a gray overcoat murmured something to his companion. A quiet laugh followed. Elias didn't turn around. He'd heard worse. Much worse, and from people who thought they were being clever about it. On the jet bridge, the terminal noise faded into the hollow echo of footsteps on metal decking, replaced by that faint smell every traveler knows. Recycled air, jet fuel, the ghost of somebody's morning coffee. At the cabin door, a flight attendant with a bright, professional smile greeted the boarding line by name, one after another, until Elias reached her. Her smile flickered for half a second before resetting itself. "Welcome aboard," she said, the warmth in it dimmed by maybe 10%. "First class is to your left." Elias paused just long enough to catch an older woman's rolling bag as it slipped from her hand and tipped toward the aisle. "Let me get that for you," he said, already reaching. He lifted it without effort and settled it into the overhead bin. Checked the latch twice to make sure it held. "Should be good now." "You're very kind," she said, surprised, and meant it. A few rows back, a small boy dropped a toy plane, the plastic wings skittering under a seat. Elias crouched, retrieved it, and pressed it back into the boy's hands. "Don't let it get away from you," he said. The boy grinned. His mother, juggling a phone call and a boarding pass, managed a distracted but genuine thank you. None of it took more than a few seconds. None of it seemed important, but it stayed, quietly, in the memory of everyone who happened to see it. He reached seat 1A and lifted his backpack into the overhead bin. As he did, his jacket sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal something in his hand. A thin metal card, catching the cabin light for a fraction of a second before he slid it back into his pocket. Maya Sinclair, restocking the galley 12 feet away, noticed. Something about it tugged at the edge of her memory, familiar in a way she couldn't yet place. Before she could look twice, a senior colleague called her name and the moment slipped past her, unfinished. By the time the cabin door sealed with its dull, final thud, Elias was seated with his eyes half closed, looking, to anyone who bothered to glance his way, like just another tired traveler headed somewhere unremarkable. He was not. And whatever he was carrying onto that aircraft that morning. In his pocket, in his silence, in the steady patience with which he watched the world sort him into a category that had nothing to do with who he actually was about to change the next 4 hours of everyone's life in that cabin. Because Elias Monroe had not boarded flight 2140 by accident, Brenda Colt had been flying first class for 19 years, and in 19 years she had built a private, unspoken system for reading a cabin before the doors ever closed. It was not written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. Regulars, high-value clients. The people whose names she memorized before boarding even began, and the people she filed, instantly and without apology, under a different heading entirely. She stepped out of the galley with her tablet in hand, scanning the cabin with the economy of motion that came from doing this exact walk 10,000 times. Her eyes landed first on seat 1B. "Good morning, Mr. Wade," she said, voice warming instantly. "Welcome back." Preston Wade glanced up from his phone and offered a brief nod. "Brenda." Her gaze slid to 1A, and her expression changed. Not dramatically. Nothing anyone else would have caught, but the warmth thinned, replaced by something colder and more assessing. She looked at the denim jacket, the backpack, the sneakers with the tread worn smooth. She had seen the boarding pass scan green at the gate. She knew, technically, that this man belonged in that seat, and still, some old reflex in her, the one that had never once been corrected, because nobody in 19 years had ever pushed back hard enough to correct it, refused to fully accept it. "Can I get you anything before departure?" she asked, and the question came out clipped, transactional, nothing like the warmth she'd handed Preston Wade 30 seconds earlier. "Water's fine," Elias said. "Thank you." She moved on without another word. 40 minutes into the flight, somewhere over eastern Tennessee, the first crack appeared. Elias stood to speak with a passing crew member about the captain's expected arrival time, a small, ordinary question, the kind first-class passengers asked constantly. Brenda intercepted him in the aisle before he'd taken 2 steps. "Sir, we ask that passengers remain seated during meal service." "I understand," Elias said. "I just wanted to ask the captain something before we land. It won't take a moment." "That's not how this works," she said, loud enough now that 3 rows heard it. "You'll need to sit down." He sat. He didn't argue. But something in Brenda's posture had shifted. She had drawn a line in front of the entire cabin, and now she needed him to cross it again, needed a reason that would justify the escalation she had already decided, somewhere beneath her own awareness, that she wanted to make. She didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, as the beverage cart worked its way forward, Elias rose again, this time simply to retrieve a folder from his backpack in the overhead bin. He reached up, unlatched it, and pulled the bag down an inch to access the front pocket. Brenda was on him before the bin had finished swinging shut. "Sir, I need you in your seat." "I'm getting something from my bag," Elias said. "I'll be seated in 10 seconds. "You've been asked twice now," she said, her voice climbing, drawing eyes from every row in the cabin. "I need you to comply immediately." Preston Wade lowered his phone an inch, watching now with real interest. A woman across the aisle stopped pretending to read her magazine. This was no longer background noise. This was a scene, and everyone in first class knew it, and not one of them said a word. Elias closed the overhead bin, folder in hand, and looked at her, not with anger, not yet, just a steady, unhurried patience that seemed, somehow, to unsettle her more than shouting would have. "I'm sitting down," he said, and he did. For the next 10 minutes, Brenda worked the cabin with brisk, overcorrected efficiency, refilling water glasses, straightening blankets, avoiding seat 1A entirely, except that every time she passed it, her jaw tightened a fraction more. Then, 31 minutes before scheduled landing, the third and final escalation arrived, and this one wasn't about seatbelts at all. Elias stood a third time, this time to speak, quietly, respectfully, with the young cabin supervisor stationed near the galley about the aircraft's estimated arrival window, information he genuinely needed for a connection. He kept his voice low. He kept his body angled away from the aisle so as not to block foot traffic. He did everything, by any reasonable measure, correctly. Brenda crossed the cabin in 4 fast steps. "That's it," she said, her voice no longer controlled, no longer performing calm. "You've been told 3 times, sit down." "I was standing to speak with the cabin supervisor," Elias said, steady, even now. "That's all." "You were instructed to remain seated," she snapped, loud enough now that heads turned 2 rows back. "You refused. That makes you a disruption." "A disruption?" The word landed strangely in the recycled air, and that was when her hand moved. The slap that followed didn't feel, to anyone who watched it, like an accident or a reflex, or even really about the seatbelt sign at all. It felt like the final inevitable step of something that had been building since 6:58 that morning at the gate, when a gate agent named Denise had looked at a denim jacket and decided, without meaning to, what kind of passenger stood in front of her. And Brenda Colt, whether she would ever admit it or not, had inherited that decision the moment Elias Monroe sat down in seat 1A. The cabin went utterly, completely still, not the ordinary quiet of a plane in flight. The other kind. The kind where nobody breathes too loudly, where every pair of eyes finds somewhere safe to land that isn't the 2 people standing in the aisle, where an entire room of adults collectively, silently agrees that the safest thing to do is nothing at all. Elias didn't touch his face. He didn't step back. He looked at her, and in that look something shifted. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something that made the silence in that cabin feel heavier than it had a moment before. Brenda's hand was still half raised when her expression began to change, and it changed fast. Too fast. The authority drained out of her face and something else rushed in to replace it, and what replaced it was not fear. It was the performance of fear, assembled in real time, the way a person assembles a story they already know they're going to need. "He grabbed me," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady in a way that didn't match the steadiness of her hands 30 seconds earlier. "He tried to push past me." A murmur moved through the cabin, quiet, uncertain, but enough to break the stillness. Preston Wade blinked. He had seen the contact. Barely a touch. Nothing that remotely matched what she was describing now. But he said nothing. Not yet. "I told him to sit down," Brenda continued, louder now, pressing a hand to her own arm as if bracing an injury that didn't exist. "He wouldn't listen. He got aggressive. Aggressive." The words spread through the cabin like something spilled. It didn't matter that it didn't fit what everyone had just watched with their own eyes. Words carried weight in a place like this. Uniforms, authority, expectation. And that weight, Brenda knew from 19 years of experience, usually outran the truth by a wide enough margin to matter. From the galley, Maya Sinclair stepped forward, without fully realizing she'd moved. Her hands trembled at her sides. "That's not what happened," she said, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the engines. Brenda's head snapped toward her. The look she gave Maya was fast, sharp, and unmistakable. "Stop." Maya's voice caught in her throat. The words she'd almost found died there, unfinished, and she hated herself for it immediately. Hated the fear that had closed her throat faster than her conscience could open it. Behind her, the cockpit door unlocked with a soft mechanical click, and Captain Gerald Hastings stepped into the cabin, filling the narrow aisle with the kind of unhurried authority that came from 22 years in the left seat. His eyes moved first to Brenda, reading her posture, then to Elias, then across the frozen faces of first class. "What's going on here, Captain?" Brenda said immediately, her voice tight, right on the edge of breaking. This passenger became disruptive. He refused instructions, stood up repeatedly during service, and then he put his hands on me. The words came fast, overlapping themselves, as if speed alone could make them more believable. Hastings turned to Elias, taking in the hoodie sleeve, the stillness, the reddening mark already fading on his cheek. Then back to Brenda. "Did he touch you?" "Yes," she said instantly. "I felt unsafe." The answer came too quickly, too clean. Hastings' jaw tightened, and something in him, some tired, practiced instinct that had settled comfortably into place over 2 decades of flying, chose the simpler story. "Sir," he said, turning fully to Elias, his tone controlled but firm, "I'm going to need you to return to your seat and remain there. We'll sort this out on the ground." "I am in my seat," Elias said, Then stay there and stop escalating. I haven't escalated anything. Hastings leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to keep the exchange from carrying past the first 3 rows, though everyone within 10 feet heard every word of it anyway. My crew is telling me you're a problem. I'm giving you a chance to make this easier on yourself. A chance, Elias repeated, and the phrase hung there between them for a long second, heavier than it should have been. Preston Wade shifted in his seat, watching more closely now. This had stopped being about a seatbelt sign or a raised voice, somewhere around the word disruption. This was something else now, a live demonstration of exactly how fast a system built on trust could decide who deserved the benefit of the doubt and who didn't. Your crew member struck me, Elias said quietly. She says otherwise, Hastings replied. Of course she does. Near the back of the cabin, a man cleared his throat. Someone else shifted in their seat. Small sounds, small movements, the kind that mean people are paying attention now, even if none of them are ready to say so out loud. Maya stood near the galley with her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles had gone white, watching Elias, watching Brenda, watching Hastings, feeling the full weight of a truth she was one sentence away from telling, and one job away from losing everything over. Here's what's going to happen, Hastings said, straightening. You're going to remain seated for the rest of this flight. No more standing, no more disruption. If it continues, we'll take further action on the ground. Further action. The meaning of it sat plainly in the recycled air. Elias held his gaze a moment longer. Then slowly he sat, not because he'd been ordered to, but because he had decided to. That distinction didn't register with most of the cabin. It registered very clearly with Maya, and somewhere beneath the surface of her own carefully rebuilt composure, it registered with Brenda too. Hastings gave a short, satisfied nod, as if the matter were closed, and disappeared back behind the cockpit door with a final hollow click. Brenda exhaled, her shoulders dropping as she reclaimed the aisle, smoothing the front of her uniform as if resetting the entire scene by hand. But something underneath the composure had shifted, and she knew it, even if she wasn't yet ready to name it. Elias sat with his hands resting lightly in his lap, calm, quiet, but no longer passive. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone. The motion was small, almost invisible. He tapped the screen once and held it to his ear. From across the aisle, Preston Wade watched closely now. From the galley, Maya's breath caught, because the way Elias held that phone didn't look like a man calling for comfort. It looked like a man giving a signal. Execute it, Elias said quietly, and ended the call. He set the phone face down on the tray table beside the thin steel card, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The cabin stayed quiet. But the silence had changed shape. It wasn't passive anymore. It was waiting. If you had been sitting in seat 3C or 4A that morning, watching all of this unfold 12 rows from the exits, would you have said something? Or would you have done exactly what everyone else did? Looked down, looked away, and told yourself, quietly, that it wasn't your business to interfere. Keep that question in mind, because in about 11 minutes, the entire cabin was going to find out that it had, in fact, always been their business. The remaining descent into LaGuardia passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the ordinary sounds of a landing sequence, wheels lowering, flaps extending, the captain's voice announcing final approach, all of it moving forward, as if nothing unusual had happened, while everyone in first class sat with the unmistakable sense that something very unusual had, in fact, happened, and was not yet finished happening. The wheels touched down at 11:14 a.m. The aircraft taxied to the gate, and that was when the first sign appeared that this flight was not going to end the way Brenda Colt had assumed it would. 2 black SUVs sat parked directly beside the jet bridge, engines running, doors already open. Not a common sight at any gate. 4 men and 1 woman in dark, unmarked jackets stood waiting at the bottom of the bridge. watching the aircraft dock with the patient stillness of people who had done this before. Hastings emerged from the cockpit as the seatbelt sign chimed off, glancing out the small window near the door, and something in his face changed for the first time all flight. Confusion, first, then something closer to alarm. Cold jet bridge air rolled in. A man in a charcoal suit stepped aboard first, flashing a credential too quickly for most passengers to read, and said in a voice that filled the narrow cabin without needing to be raised, "Sterling Horizon, Flight 2140. We need everyone to remain in their seats for a few minutes." "This won't take long." Brenda straightened instinctively, falling back into the posture of someone accustomed to being the one in charge of a cabin. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked at her for a long moment. "Brenda Colt?" Something in her chest went cold at the sound of her own name. "Yes, we're going to need to speak with you." He turned his gaze toward the front row. "And you'll want to come with us too, sir," he said. But his tone toward Elias was entirely different, respectful, almost deferential. The tone people use when they already know exactly who they're addressing. Every head in first class turned toward Elias Monroe. He rose calmly, retrieved his backpack, and reached for the thin steel card still sitting on his tray table. He held it for a moment, long enough for the overhead light to catch the engraving clearly, for the first time. A hawk in flight, wings spread, etched into brushed steel above three small letters, WKH Whitfield Kessler Holdings. Maya's breath caught. She knew that name. Every flight attendant at Sterling Horizon knew that name, whispered about in crew lounges for the better part of 18 months. The private equity group that had quietly acquired a controlling stake in the airline the previous fall. So quietly that most employees only found out from a line in their benefits statement. "Mr. Monroe," the man in the charcoal suit said, "if you're ready." Brenda's face went through three expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like the floor dropping out from under her. "Monroe," she repeated, barely a whisper. As in the majority stakeholder of this airline," the man said simply. Yes, the cabin didn't gasp. It did something quieter and somehow worse. It went completely perfectly still, the particular stillness of 40 people simultaneously replaying the last 4 hours in their heads and understanding, all at once, exactly what they had watched happen and exactly what they had chosen not to do about it. Elias didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at Brenda, and there was nothing in his expression to grab onto. No anger, no satisfaction, nothing but a quiet, terrible clarity. "No," Brenda said, her voice climbing, panic breaking through 19 years of composure all at once. "This is wrong. You can't." The click of metal stopped her mid-sentence. One of the agents had already fastened restraints around her wrists, quick and practiced. Her voice rose, cracking now. "I've worked for this airline for 19 years. You don't understand." "We understand more than you think," the agent said, not unkindly, but without a trace of give in it either. Brenda looked at Elias one last time, searching, desperate, hunting for something in his face she could hold on to. There was nothing there to hold. No cruelty, no mercy. Just the truth, settled and finished. She lowered her head. And for the first time since boarding had begun that morning, Brenda Colt was completely silent. The agents moved efficiently, guiding her, and, moments later, Captain Hastings toward the jet bridge. The cabin watched every second of it. Nobody looked away this time. Because now they understood exactly what silence had allowed, exactly what quick judgment had manufactured out of nothing, and exactly what 4 minutes of truth had finally, unavoidably revealed. Elias remained standing in the aisle, a moment, longer, the mark on his cheek nearly faded now, under the cabin lights. Maya looked at him, her hands finally loosening at her sides. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Elias shook his head. "Not yet." Because what had happened in the air, it turned out, was only the beginning. What was waiting on the ground was going to be considerably harder for Brenda Colt to explain away. 3 days later, Charlotte moved the way it always did on a Monday morning. Traffic threading between glass towers on South Tryon Street, the light rail humming past storefronts, commuters crossing at Trade Street with their coats pulled tight against a wind that hadn't quite let go of winter. Nothing about the city paused. Nothing about it remembered. But inside the headquarters of Sterling Horizon Airlines, on the 31st floor of the Vance Tower, everything had already changed. The lobby that morning was quiet in a way that unsettled the people who worked there. Too quiet for 8:40 on a weekday. Conversations had gone hushed. Movements were careful. Because by then, nearly everyone in the building had seen at least part of the video. A passenger, a confrontation, federal agents boarding an aircraft at Gate C-14, and a name nobody expected. Elias Monroe. Attached to a holding company nobody outside the executive floor was supposed to know owned 41% of the airline. The boardroom on the 31st floor was full by 8:50. 11 executives sat around a long walnut table, their tablets untouched, their coffee gone cold in front of them. They weren't waiting for a meeting. They were waiting for an answer. The door opened. Elias Monroe walked in wearing a charcoal suit this time, not denim, not a backpack. Clean lines, no wasted motion, the same unchanged calm in his expression that suddenly, to every person in that room, made a great deal more sense than it had 3 days earlier. Every head turned. Nobody spoke. He didn't ask for permission. He walked to the head of the table and sat down. The silence that followed was total. A man near the screen at the front of the room, General Counsel Warren Ashby, a slight, precise man who had spent 11 years quietly documenting things nobody wanted documented, cleared his throat and tapped his tablet once. The wall display came alive with charts, timestamps, figures. Sterling Horizon is currently carrying debt exposure exceeding $4.3 billion. Ashby began. Internal audits over the past 14 months show repeated discrepancies in cargo revenue reporting, 22 unresolved compliance flags, and a documented pattern of employee misconduct complaints closed without investigation. Each sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Customer complaints involving discriminatory treatment, specifically targeting passengers based on appearance and perceived socioeconomic status. Number at least 31 over the last 3 years, Ashby continued. Of those, 26 were closed within 48 hours, with no documented follow-up. Employee reports of the same pattern of behavior from senior cabin crew were, in at least 4 cases, removed from internal HR systems entirely. A man near the far end of the table shifted in his seat. "That's not entirely accurate," he said, quiet but sharp. Ashby didn't look at him. "It's fully documented. Timestamps, internal emails, HR case numbers. I'm happy to walk the board through each one individually, if anyone would like." Nobody asked him to. Elias leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, his eyes moving slowly from one executive to the next, not accusing, not raising his voice, just watching, the way he seemed to watch everything. "This company didn't fail in an afternoon," he said finally, his voice carrying an authority nobody in that room questioned. "It failed slowly, quietly, in ways that were easy to look past if you were the one signing off on them. It failed every single time somebody in this building decided it was easier not to see what was right in front of them." Nobody moved. Because they understood, in that moment, that this wasn't only about the numbers on the screen. It was about every quiet decision that had led to them. Elias reached forward and set a thin folder on the table. It made a soft sound. In that silence, it echoed like a gavel. "Effective. Immediately, the current executive structure of this company is dissolved," he said. A breath caught somewhere in the room. Nobody protested. Nobody could. "This airline is being rebuilt," Elias continued. "New leadership. An independent oversight board reporting directly to the ownership group. Every unresolved complaint in the last 5 years will be reopened and reviewed by outside counsel. Every employee who came forward and was ignored will be heard, formally, on the record. He looked around the table, not with anger, but with something closer to clarity.
"This isn't punishment," he said.
"It's correction." The door opened again, softly this time. Every head turned. Maya Sinclair stepped inside, wearing a simple navy suit, hands loosely clasped in front of her. She looked different than she had 3 days earlier, on that aircraft, steadier, though the nerves hadn't entirely left her eyes. Elias nodded toward her. "This is Maya Sinclair. Effective today, she is Vice President of Customer Experience for this airline." The room stirred, not loudly, but enough. A man across the table frowned. "With respect," he said, "she's a junior flight attendant with 2 years of service." Elias turned to him, unhurried. "She's the only person on that aircraft who chose the truth when silence would have been considerably easier for her." He let the words sit a moment. "That's not a junior qualification. That's the only qualification that's ever mattered in this room." Nobody argued with that. There was no argument for it. Maya stood a little straighter, not because she felt powerful, but because, for the first time in a long time, she felt seen for exactly what she'd done and what it had cost her to do it. Elias rose. The meeting was over, not with a vote, not with debate, but with a decision that had already been made before anyone in that room walked in. He crossed toward the door, then paused, looking back once. "No one in this building is invisible," he said. "Remember that the next time you're deciding whether something is worth documenting." Then he left. Brenda Colt's fall was not slow, and it was not quiet. Within 72 hours of the incident, footage from the cabin, captured, it turned out, by 3 separate passengers who had said nothing at the time but filmed everything on their phones, had circulated widely enough that Sterling Horizon's legal team could no longer contain it to an internal matter. She was formally terminated the same day. The video reached national coverage. Her 19 years of service dissolved into a 2-paragraph statement that never once used her name. The federal charge that followed, assault, filed by the airline itself on Elias's insistence, though he had never once asked for it publicly, cost her considerably more than her job. It cost her the flight attendant's union certification she'd spent nearly 2 decades building, revoked within a month, by a review board that had, it turned out, quietly received 4 prior complaints against her that had gone nowhere until now. It cost her a pension she had assumed, right up until the morning it happened, was untouchable. She appeared at her disciplinary hearing 3 weeks later with a lawyer beside her and a prepared statement in her hand. And even then, reading from the page, she used the word misunderstanding twice. It wasn't until the review board played the unedited footage in full, all 4 hours of escalation compressed into 11 minutes, her own voice rising over a man who had done, by any honest measure, absolutely nothing wrong, that something in her finally broke open. She didn't cry in front of the board. She sat very still instead. The same kind of stillness Elias had shown her in that aisle 3 weeks earlier, except hers carried no calm inside it at all, only the sudden, unbearable weight of watching herself clearly for what felt like the first time in 19 years. Afterward, alone in the hallway outside the hearing room, she said something to her lawyer that never made it into any statement, any headline, any footage. She said, "I thought I was protecting something." And then, quieter, mostly to herself, "I don't know what I thought I was protecting anymore." It wasn't an apology. Nobody who read about it later would call it redemption. But it was, for the first time, something closer to the truth than anything she'd said since the moment her hand had moved in that aisle. And for Brenda Colt, that quiet, private recognition arriving 3 weeks too late to change anything was its own kind of sentence. Captain Gerald Hastings resigned before the review board could reach him. Choosing early retirement over a hearing he already knew he'd lose. He never spoke publicly about what happened. Those who knew him said he simply stopped flying altogether, unable to explain, even to himself, why he'd taken one version of the truth over another so quickly, so completely, without asking a single follow-up question. 6 months after that flight, Sterling Horizon looked like a different airline. Not because the planes were new, or the uniforms had changed, but because 31 reopened complaints had become 31 formal apologies. 4 of them accompanied by settlements large enough to matter, and because an anonymous reporting system, designed personally by Maya Sinclair, built out of the exact silence she'd once been too afraid to break, had logged over 400 employee reports in its first 90 days. Not 400 new problems. 400 old ones, finally given somewhere safe to land. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Elias Monroe stepped out of the Vance Tower onto South Tryon Street, the cool air brushing against his face, the ordinary noise of the city settling around him. Horns, footsteps, a bus pulling away from the curb. He walked a few blocks, no security trailing behind him, no driver waiting at the curb, just a man in a plain gray jacket moving through a city that had no idea who he was. Near the corner of 4th Street, an older man struggled with a grocery bag, the bottom seams straining, cans shifting dangerously inside. Elias stepped forward without hesitation. "Here," he said, taking the bag gently from the man's arms. "Let me get that for you." The man looked up, startled. "Appreciate it," he said. Elias adjusted the weight, secured the bag, and handed it back. "Take care," he said, and kept walking. No cameras, no audience, no recognition. Just a small, ordinary moment. The same kind of moment nobody had thought to notice on a flight to LaGuardia 6 months earlier. Except now it meant something different, because the truth of who he was had already been revealed, and it turned out the truth had nothing to do with what he owned at all. A person's worth was never about the label on their jacket, or the seat number printed on their boarding pass, or how quickly a stranger decided what kind of person they were before they'd said a single word. It was about what they did when nobody was watching, when there was nothing to gain from doing it, when the only reward for kindness was the quiet fact of having done it. And maybe that, in the end, was the part of the story that had ever actually mattered. If you had been sitting in that cabin, in 2B and 4A, anywhere close enough to see it happen, would you have stayed silent, the way almost everyone did? Or would you have been the one to speak? Because in the end, it wasn't the slap that defined what happened on that flight. It was the 11 seconds it took Maya Sinclair to step forward with her voice shaking and tell the truth, when telling a comfortable lie would have cost her nothing at all. This isn't really a story about power arriving in an unfamiliar jacket. It's a story about what silence quietly allows to happen, over and over, until somebody finally decides it's worth the risk to say something different. If this story reached you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, maybe even yourself, go ahead and hit like, so it finds its way to someone who needs to hear it today. Share it if you know someone who's ever been made to feel invisible for the way they were dressed, or spoken to, or judged before they'd said a word. And leave a comment. Have you ever been in that cabin? And if you had, which side of the silence would you have been on? I read every single one.